Hi, I'm Jazmin, and this is Not Another PD. It's for helping professionals who are tired of theoretical training that doesn't translate to the work you actually do. Here, we talk boundaries, leadership, systems, and how to protect your well-being while doing complex work every day. I'm so glad you're here. Episode 31. I remember asking for specific feedback in supervision back when I was working in child protection. And I wasn't asking for praise from my supervisor. I wasn't asking for a list of things that I was doing well in. I was actually asking what I needed to improve on with the ultimate aim of progressing within the organization. And I really didn't get anything specific back. In this episode, I'm going to be introducing you all to career interfering behaviours in supervision. And career interfering behaviours in supervision, I was really inspired by a recent LinkedIn post by an amazing accredited mental health social worker, Alex Wilson, and her business is Mindful Recovery Services. She's someone I really admire, and I've done some of her training in the past on DBT, dialectical behavioral therapy. And her recent post was talking about therapy interfering behaviors. And for those of you who work directly with clients, which is most of you, you would definitely be familiar with some therapy interfering behaviors. And I will link Alex Wilson's profile as well in the show notes so you can actually see the post I'm talking about. Some of the therapy interfering behaviors that Alex had spoken about in this post were missing sessions, escalating in sessions, struggling to engage appropriately with their therapist, as some examples. When I saw this post from Alex, I started to think about what are some ways that supervisors or people in more senior roles to you can actually interfere. What are some of those behaviors that may hinder your professional development and your career growth in your role? So it was very much inspired by Alex's post, but I'm putting a different spin on it. In this solo episode, we're going to be looking at what are some of these career or professional development interfering behaviors. And I will talk a little bit more about some of my own experience and what I've seen in a lot of the helping professionals that I mentor, that I coach, that I supervise, because these occurrences are not a once-off. They're happening more often than we would like to think that they are. So before we go into greater detail here, I'll give some examples on when I'm talking about career or professional development interfering behaviors that a supervisor may be doing. I'll give a few examples. And if you're listening and you think, oh, these are resonating with me, then it sounds like you have maybe have been in a situation in which you had a supervisor, manager, or mentor that wasn't actually supporting your professional development. So, and there'll be many more examples like this, but this is just a few common ones that I've seen in my experience so far in this sector. The first one being vague feedback. So when you ask for specific feedback, and it could be the example I shared, which, as I mentioned, I will go into a little bit deeper detail, but if you ask, say, for example, if you want to progress to a more senior role in your organization, so you may be asking, what's some specific feedback, those areas for further development that you can work on. So you maybe found yourself receiving vague feedback, such as, you're doing fine, you're doing great, just keep doing what you're doing. It's very vague. There's nothing specific. It doesn't give you anything to go on whatsoever in terms of your professional growth. It sort of just leaves your request for feedback at a standstill. So it's not super helpful at all. The second example is actually avoiding giving constructive feedback. So sometimes and we all have skill gaps, knowledge gaps where we need to develop in certain areas, and that's normal in the work that we do. We can never be experts in every single area. There's always things we need to work on. So if you find yourself asking for specific feedback around your performance, and your supervisor's actually avoiding giving you that constructive feedback, maybe they fear damaging the relationship with you, maybe they're conflict avoidant, that's a really common one. Maybe they don't want to lose you, because chances are you are actually really good at what you do, and your supervisor or the organization more broadly doesn't actually want to lose you. You're a valued member of the team, they don't want to lose you, so they may actively and deliberately avoid giving constructive feedback that's going to help your professional development. Another example, which I've commonly seen, is really generic PDPs. So if you have a yearly or quarterly, however the cycle looks like at your place of employment, where you sit down with your supervisor and look at your professional goals for, say, for example, for the year ahead or the quarter ahead. I've seen some supervisors encourage their staff just to have the same generic goals, what I would call vanilla or cookie cutter goals, really bland, really boring. They're not specific to yourself, your skills, your interests, your qualifications, what your professional values are. They're cookie cutter goals that if you have a look at your PDP or your career goals, they may mirror those of your colleagues in the same team, which tends to indicate that they're very generic, they're not specific to you. So these generic goals or these generic PDPs may not actually be, you might find that they're not aligned to your career aspirations, either your long-term career goals, even your short-term career goals. So for example, if you had mentioned to your supervisor that you expressed interest in working in a different team or doing some really specific niche training in a certain area, and then that not being reflected in your actual career goals, your career development goals, that's another example. Another example is only focusing on risk or compliance. In the work that we all do, or if we don't currently work with maybe clients or at-risk client groups or really vulnerable client groups, which many of us do, there's often that risk. So it could be organizational reputation risk. If you make a mistake, then the organization, they could risk their reputation being damaged. Or when I used to work in banking, the bank used to talk about brand damage. So brand damage to the organization if you were to make a mistake, or if you were to just act in a way that wasn't in accordance with the organization's core values. There could be that that risk, that compliance. A lot of roles, especially in the NDIS space, are really focused on KPIs, and they're not necessarily, and not always, but sometimes I find that they're not focused on the individual development or individual strengths of their team members who are doing the the work every day with the clients, with often very vulnerable client group. Another example is a lack of psychological safety. So you might find that you don't feel like emotionally safe to actually speak up to your manager. Perhaps if there's an amazing training that you've had your eye on, and it's not a very expensive training, it might be very low cost, but you might have had your eye on this training for a period of time, and you may not have the financial resources yourself to fund it out of your pocket. And if it's directly related to the work that you're doing, you probably shouldn't be expected to self-fund it anyway. So even if your organization has a budget for training, you might find yourself not feeling safe to actually ask if they would permit you to do the training. Often as well, it may not be a lack of financial resources by maybe the concern isn't that your organization doesn't have the budget for professional development to pay for the training. Maybe you don't actually feel psychologically safe to ask for time off from the direct client work to actually attend the training. So that's another issue as well. I've seen this quite a lot in the helping professionals that I support, that I work with, and they actually say that if there's an online training that their employer has registered them in, or if they've registered themselves, then they're still expected to work. So I've always been of the opinion that if you're attending a professional learning or professional development, that is your work day. But a pattern that I have seen, and I wish I hadn't seen it, is that the expectation that even if you're attending a 6 or 7 hour training, whether it's online or in person, to me, that's irrelevant. That detail is so irrelevant that they're still expected to respond very quickly to any emails that come through. They're expected to return any client calls. They're often expected to turn their cameras off. So they're officially attending the training. They can get their name ticked off, but they're not really engaging because they're doing a lot of work for their employer, for the clients, for their colleagues, while they're supposed to be attending training. And if we don't feel safe to actually self-advocate as helping professionals and be able to say, I'm not able to complete that task today. I'm not able to make that phone call or do this admin task because I'm actually on training, so I'm away from my core roles, then that's also a sign of there's a lack of psychological safety with your direct manager. And over time, these career or professional development interfering behaviors do actually impact your confidence. It can slow down your career progression, which does negatively impact your confidence. And you could then see your colleagues that you studied with, that you've worked at in previous roles, moving up in their career, moving into leadership, moving into different specialized areas, while you might find that you're staying stagnant or still in your career because you actually are unfortunately supervised by a manager who is engaging in some of those behaviors, and you don't actually feel that they're supporting your career development. So there's definitely the emotional layer of being someone who is supervised by someone more senior than you who is engaging in some of these behaviors. So apart from impacting your confidence, there's some other feelings that you may find yourself experiencing, such as feeling stuck in your career and where you're at. You might be questioning yourself and questioning your ability to be able to continue doing the work, or maybe even finding yourself overworking. So maybe you're going above and beyond and desperately trying to impress your supervisor so that they may actually support your request to do some further training. Or maybe you might find yourself engaging in some people pleasing behaviors, just especially if your manager or your supervisor is a little bit difficult to communicate with. You might find yourself trying to appease them and not trying to ruffle any tail feathers or make any waves. And that's just a little bit about, in greater detail, what we're talking about here in this episode. And I'm going to share a little bit in greater detail what I've seen in my work. So going back to that time when I was working in child protection, and this was such a long time ago now, I feel like if I were to go back and do that role now, that I would be reacting very, very differently, and would be more assertive around what are my career goals and how I would like my supervisor to support me in that. But it was earlier on in my career, and I guess, the saying goes, we don't know what we don't know. So that's, and I think it's important as well that we be kind to our earlier selves or even our current selves if we think, well, we're experiencing these from our supervisor, that firstly, it's never our fault. And when we have supervisors who interact with us like this, it's it's more a reflection of where they're at, and do they feel confident in their own leadership ability? Do they need some more support to be able to support their staff? That's why I'm a huge advocate in leaders actually having their own supervision, because they can actually reflect on their leadership approach and what support do they actually need. Do they need more feedback, specific feedback from their direct supervisor? Because even your supervisor has a supervisor themselves, right? And even if it's your supervisor is the owner or the founder of the organization you work at, they would still have really trusted mentors or guides that they lean on if they need support. And if they don't, then that's probably why they're struggling in being able to support you with your career development. So it's important to also note that many leaders and supervisors were not actually trained to supervise staff. You may be a helping professional, you may have an allied health degree, such as social work, psychology, counselling, OT, speech therapy, the list goes on. You most likely have a qualification in what you do, but you may be working for an organisation or being supervised by a leader who doesn't have the same skill set. If you're working for a school, your supervisor could be a trained teacher who was really trained and skilled in education, but not so much with supervising allied health staff. And I know because I've worked in schools before and have been supervised by teachers. So it's, it is a very different approach to being supervised by a fellow, allied health colleague or professional. So leaders also have a lot of pressures as well that they're meeting, and leaders often have their own KPIs and their own expectations. And sometimes the expectations, just like the expectations on the practitioners, all of you, may be unrealistic to achieve in any given workday or any given work week. Often the expectations placed on supervisors by organisations is similarly unrealistic and unattainable as well. So the workload definitely can be a factor. So this can certainly lead to leaders and supervisors feeling really, overburdened, overwhelmed, and may then default to avoiding having difficult conversations with their staff if they're not performing, for example, and focusing on just the daily work, getting through the day, supporting their teams in the here and now without looking into the future and that career development. And I don't like to ever have an episode that's just like, oh, it's, all doom and gloom. Absolutely not. I always like to look at, well, if we recognize that something's happening and and we are looking to, well, what's a different approach? Well, that's the importance of good supervision. So what does good supervision look like? And how I supervise, or how I structure a supervision session, is that I always, and it's not all doom and gloom like we sometimes think that it is. So if you're listening and you're a leader and you think, oh, maybe am I doing some of these things? Or if you're a helping professional, so you're a practitioner and you're thinking, yes, I have experienced or I'm currently experiencing some of these career development interfering behaviors from your supervisor, then I just want to assure you that there is a different approach. And these are some of the, I guess, my tips, what I've found helpful both as a supervisor and leader for others, but also when I was being supervised. And I'm sure that if we think about it, and I encourage you to think about it, that we all have I'm sure, both positive and not so positive experiences of being supervised ourselves. So if you're a leader listening, I'm sure that you would have had your own experience of receiving, really supportive supervision and then not so supportive supervision. So here are some tips that I'm hoping will be helpful. So the first is to actually provide specific behavior based feedback. So instead of saying, "Yeah, you're doing great, all good there, Jazz," actually be more specific. And similar to for anyone who's worked with children or if you're a parent, if you just say to your kids, "Yeah, great behavior," then they might hear that as praise. "Oh, yeah, I'm going well," but you're not actually helping them either like do more of the behavior you'd like to see or do less of the behavior you don't want to see. So if you've, for example, if you've parent yourself or you work with young people. I know when I worked with young people I did a lot of groups when I was a school-based mental health practitioner. I did a lot of groups with young people. I'd facilitate social emotional learning groups with a real focus on mental health promotion and sort of and try to increase the help-seeking behaviors of the young people in the group. And I could have just given, general vague feedback to the group and saying, "Yeah, everyone did well today. See you next week." And yes, they may get that little boost in their confidence in that moment, but it's not going to stick with them because it's not specific behavior based feedback. So, an example of what I've said in a group before is actually saying, and let's just say the young person's name is Johnny. I could say, "Johnny, I really liked how you listened without interrupting to the other members of the group. That was amazing. Well done." You've actually linked it to a behavior. So Johnny was listening intently to the other students and he wasn't interrupting. That's specific behavior based feedback. So that's what we need to see more in supervision. Another one is actually linking feedback to values and goals. So, as a supervisor, we should always know some of the core values and goals are of those that we supervise. So, are they their career goals? Are they, health and well-being goals? What are some of their goals? What are some of their core values? So, what's really important to them? Are they someone with really good family values? It's so important as supervisors to create psychological safety. So, to ensure that your supervisee actually knows you can, feel free to challenge me on anything. I welcome feedback too as a supervisor and just create that opportunity, that learning experience for everybody, not just the supervisee, not just the practitioner, but also the leader as well. So that's really important. If you're the person receiving the supervision, you'll actually leave feeling that your supervision and your career goals are like individualized to you. They're actually realistic. And then you'll leave with some goals or some action items that you'll be able to take away and use to further your career goals. So it's just so important. And I integrate this in my supervision approach as well. And I really love to get to know those that I work with. So if you work with me, then you know that I do get to know you and I remember things that you say. So if you said, "I'm going on a holiday," then I'll remember that. And then I'll ask you, "Well, how was your holiday?" If I know that you have, kids that have been sick, then I'll check in with you in the next session and say, "I hope the illness has ceased in your house." So it's so important to actually build that professional relationship. And then, then you'll feel that you're doing the best you can as a supervisor. But then for those that are being supervised, you'll feel that your supervisor sees you as an individual and not just one of many. And I think that's really important as well. And a lot of people, helping professionals, come to me for either individual supervision with me or group supervision with me after having this experience, and then they're looking for something different. So commonly I hear that they are sometimes, not only are they not supported by their supervisor, but sometimes they'll say, oh, my supervisor actually didn't support my career goals. So I've had helping professionals come to me and work with me now, but they've said that they've had experiences where they've been denied reasonable requests for training, to do training funded by their organization, or even be allowed a few hours off to do the training that's really aligned with their career goals. So it's definitely something that I'm hearing time and time again. So I thought this episode was quite timely. And I wanted to end on a few kind of practical reflections that will hopefully be helpful. We haven't asked our supervisors for feedback, for specific feedback. And it's important before we start criticizing supervisors and say, hey, they're actually not giving me they're not giving me adequate supervision. They're not supporting me with my career development. But also, we need to take responsibilities as the people receiving supervision. We need to take responsibility for that ourselves, for our own career development. So by actually asking specific questions, like of your supervisor, such as, can I have feedback around this certain area? Can you actually let me know if I'm working with this particular client group? What are some knowledge gaps or skill gaps you've noticed in me work to address? And also ask yourself, do I feel safe actually asking for feedback? So you may have had a negative experience before in seeking feedback. So actually ask yourself, do I currently feel safe asking for feedback? And if not, it could be an indicator that you may need to seek a bit of support elsewhere, whether it's through external supervision with a supervisor such as myself, or maybe some counseling, maybe EAP counseling, or some other support around building up your confidence and around those having those difficult conversations and your assertive communication skills to be able to feel a bit safer to have these conversations. So think about those things. And I wanted to then go back to the example that I started sharing back when I was in child protection. So, for anyone who's worked in child protection, and I don't know whether it's the same in every single state and territory, I think it is quite similar that you have like your base level entry role, like the practitioner level, and then the more you grow and develop, then you might be like a, advanced worker, senior worker, and so then you might be a team leader. So there's like with most government roles, they're hierarchical and there's always opportunity to grow, or there's always a position sitting above yours that you could potentially move into if you had the right skill set and there was availability, a vacancy in that role. So I was starting off at just that base entry level role and relatively new to the sector. I'd worked for a few years in the public housing space and a little bit in an NGO, but I was, I guess, relatively new to the child protection space, and I'd been working there for, I think it was maybe a couple of years at this point. And I I found, and sometimes you might find that your supervisor isn't very approachable, maybe as a person, maybe they always appear flustered. So sometimes it can be difficult to pluck up the courage to actually ask for feedback when they always seem unavailable, perhaps even unapproachable. But I remember I always was someone who felt so uncomfortable seeking feedback because, like most of us, we don't always handle it well if we receive negative feedback. That if we think, oh, I'm going amazingly well in this area, and your supervisor says, actually, you're not really, then that's a confidence killer. It really is. So to even be vulnerable enough to put yourself in that vulnerable space, and Brene Brown speaks a lot about vulnerability. If you're familiar with her work, she speaks beautifully and eloquently about vulnerability, but it's a really uncomfortable feeling. But you need to, I guess, make yourself vulnerable in order to ask for the feedback. So I had this team manager that I didn't think was particularly approachable. And I finally one day plucked up the courage to ask her in supervision. It was a scheduled supervision. I didn't just ambush her when she was in the middle of an important meeting. It was my scheduled supervision. And I asked her, I expressed my interest in moving up to the advanced practitioner role, and I'd said, I'm really interested in progressing, and I would really love to hear from you. What are the areas I'd need to work on so then I'd be meeting the expected capabilities of the advanced role? And I said, any feedback would be so welcomed, and then I can work on these things. And I would love to also put a specific goal in my PDP around moving to the advanced practitioner. And my supervisor, not only did she not give me specific feedback, she didn't even really respond to my request for feedback. I think she just said, "Oh, yeah, okay," and then that was it. And so there were numerous career development interfering behaviors that I experienced in that role as well. And another one was when I had asked to do a specific specialized training that was it was a requirement that you did this training if you wanted to be able to be the lead practitioner on specific cases with specific protective concerns. So it was a really specialized training, and I had heard about the training and had colleagues that had been through the training. They said it was really valuable, and then that was also that doing that training was also aligned with one of my career development goals to move up to the advanced role. So in a separate conversation, given that my first request for feedback fell flat on its face, I then asked my supervisor, I expressed interest in this training, and I heard that there was a wait list because it was only run every so often, and so there was a wait list apparently. So I'd asked I think by this time I think I had been that role about 2 years or so, and I'd asked my supervisor, I expressed interest in the training and said, I'd love it if you could put me on the wait list for the training whenever it's run. Please keep me in mind. And I'll never forget, my supervisor said to me, there's people in the team that have been here longer than you, so I'm going to prioritize their need for doing the training above you. And I said, oh yeah, okay. I said, I understand that, but if I could still be put on the list, and of course I understand they'll be ahead of me, if there's a space, I would really appreciate it. And she goes, well, as I said, like, there's people that are a lot more experienced than you, and they're still waiting. And again, it sort of fell a little bit flat. It landed flat. And so then I didn't pluck up the courage after that really to seek feedback, and as a result, I didn't grow professionally. I ended up going on maternity leave anyway, and then returning and had a different team manager with a totally different experience, and obviously I'm not in that role anymore. And but what I will say about that situation is that it can really, and it did for me for a very long time, impact my confidence to actually speak up and be able to request feedback, to be able to share, well, these are my career goals and this training's really aligned. I'd really love to be able to do it. And we self-advocate amazingly well for our clients, but why is it that we don't self-advocate for ourselves in meeting our career development needs? So I encourage you to seek the support, those supports around you. So your loved ones, your trusted colleagues, and also engage in supervision that you really find sees you as an individual, sees your values, supports you to, to work towards your goals, whatever they may be. And they look very different to everyone else. And if you want to work a little bit closer with me, I still do have some individual supervision spots before June 30. So if you're short of your supervision hours, I do have some limited spots available for one-on-one. And I also do have my next round of group supervision starting in June as well. And I have 2 streams for that. So practitioners and also business owners. You can find all the details in the show notes. And if you're all good with your supervision hours, but you want a little bit more support around how you like your boundaries and implementing boundaries, then I do have a self-paced training course called Boundaries as Practitioners. It's just $59 and you get access immediately, which is super convenient. We're all so busy and you'll have lifetime access to that. So I understand you're busy. You can take as long as you need to listen to it. It'll be there for you, including the resources. There's a boundaries action plan as well to just to get you started. And we're almost at the end of the episode, but I just wanted to, summarize some of what we've been speaking about. And I'd love to hear your thoughts, whether you found this helpful, if you'd like to have more episodes on this. I would love to hear from you. But some of those main common career or professional development interfering behaviors that we may be seeing are the vague feedback being provided, supervisors actively avoiding giving any constructive or negative feedback, really generic cookie cutter PDPs that don't reflect your career goals and your values. Supervision or managers who only focus on risk or compliance, not your individual professional development needs and your strengths as the amazing, skilled helping professional and practitioner that you are. And lack of psychological safety in actually being able to self-advocate for your career development, such as not feeling safe to ask for a few hours off or a day off or a couple of days off to attend training. And then there's that, then we spoke of the emotional impact that if you've experienced these, and it does also come with that emotional impact for you as well. And if you've experienced these things, then it's not a fault of you. And if you're a leader who's wanting more support around how you show up for your teams, then I also do provide leadership consultation and also supervision for leaders. So I just welcome you to reach out and not to keep struggling with these things alone, because there is support out there. Thank you for joining me on Not Another PD. If this episode was helpful and you'd like to find out more, you'll find ways to work with me in the show notes. And if there's a topic you would like covered or someone you think should be on the podcast, I'd love to hear from you. Remember, clear boundaries don't just protect our clients,